Honorable Dr. Afetoli, Madam Pamela Hailey, and Mr. Eric, as indeed my fellow pilgrims on the journey towards wisdom. I believe that the ultimate aspiration of all the rivers, the streams, and the brooks is to meet and merge with the ocean. Just as indeed the ultimate aspiration of all education and learning and training is to dissolve and find wisdom. I'm so grateful that we have a conference with the difference. It is to discover and make our own this journey of learning towards wisdom. I'm so humbled to be part of this great gathering of kindred souls. We've had two amazing presentations already this morning, and being the third in line is often a disadvantage. But we begin with a blank slate. I would like to hope that by now all the great ideas that featured in the first two presentations would have dissolved into this whiteness. I've been a teacher and an educator for 3 decades plus years. And I've been reflecting on my own role as a teacher and trying to locate a soul for my role. Not with much success. But I believe that every nation, as indeed every individual, ought to have a dream. I liken the gross national happiness alternative development vision as articulated by His Majesty the Fourth King of Bhutan to the North Star that sailors on the wide open seas many years ago, when precision equipment like the ones that we have today were not invented, to find their direction to the safety of the port. In the same way, even though we do not look at the North Star as often as the mariners did many years ago, all nations and all societies do actually need a North Star to point to the direction that we would like to take our societies towards, our nations towards, and prayerfully our world towards. And if a nation has a big dream, just as gross national happiness as an alternative development pathway is a big dream for Bhutan, the subsystems of that nation ought to embrace, honor, and advance that dream. And education in any nation or society is a very important subsystem of that nation or society. We have in our education system, spanning schools, colleges, universities, and training centers, young men and women, boys and girls, children, the most precious segment of any society. And these are people who are going to be our leaders tomorrow. So we owe it to them an experience for learning that helps them not only to sharpen their brains and their skills, but also to build faith and character, to make them wise. We have built an unprecedented network of schools, colleges, and universities around the world, like we never did before. But has our world become wiser, more enlightened, more at peace with itself? Does education have anything to do with the making of the world a better place and the making of life more beautiful? As early as 1934, a great poet, T.S. Eliot, had written in The Rock, all our knowledge leads us nearer to ignorance. All our ignorance leads us nearer to death. Nearness to death, but no nearer to God. As an educator, a man of faith, a man of hope, it is not right for me to be quoting The Rock from T.S. Eliot. However, I guess this is the state of the world. With all the knowledge and information and learning that we have acquired, is the world becoming a better place? Are we getting more enlightened? Have we received the wisdom that ought to have come to us through education that was so rightly called the noble sector? For some very good reason, I guess, some wise people in the past called education the noble sector. Even health wasn't called the noble sector, but education was. It was intended to cultivate the nobility of human mind, the nobility of heart, thereby inspiring the nobility of action. That was the intent of education. Today, I guess, there's been a kind of fall from grace. Education is all but nobles. That is why we thought Bhutan's big dream as a nation was to follow the path of gross national happiness as a national dream. The subsystems had to do their parts to advance the dream. So what would education system do in the country to advance gross national happiness? And to this end, in 2010, we invited some of the finest educational thought leaders to a 10-day conference that advised the Ministry of Education to initiate a process to infuse the ideas of gross national happiness into the overall education system in the country. And we conducted 6-day-long workshops for all the educational leaders in the country. And we were counting something like 600 school leaders and 600 deputy leaders. So we had 3 6-day workshops, intensive engagements, to try to reflect on how the education system and practitioners of education would be able to understand and infuse the country's development vision through the education system. We call this program Educating for Gross National Happiness. I'm not so sure as to how many education systems would today have space for a program that often seems rather too idealistic or philosophical. But what is education if it is not idealistic? Education ought to be able to build faith. It ought to build hope. We owe it to the young men and women who come to our church. If nothing else, education ought to be able to build and advance faith and hope faith in the goodness of the world, faith in the beauty of life. With all its imperfections, with all its inadequacies, it is still a good world, and life is still beautiful. Young men and women, boys and girls, children ought to know that life is worth living. It's worth working hard for ourselves. And this is the kind of education system we believe we owe to our children who will be our leaders tomorrows. And the strategy that we developed to advance this program of educating for gross national happiness was called Building Green Schools as a means to an end, and the end was and is green Bhutan. I have to explain what we mean by green or greenery. Green is a color, it's a fundamental color, but at the same time, it is also a metaphor. It is a metaphor for anything and everything that supports life. And by life, we mean human life, animal life, bird life, reptiles, life in all its infinite variety, life of the earth, our planet. So anything that supports and sustains life in all its abundant variety is green. So we can have green schools, we can have a green economy, green homes, green parliaments, green politics, green to support and sustain life. So we feel that there are claims that education systems and practitioners of education ought to be not only aware of, but deeply, deeply mindful of. Today, in most education systems, the only claim that we honor is the claim of the employment market, corporations, factories. And the employment market is often very heartless. Corporations are often heartless. Companies are often heartless. And if the education system is to attune itself to the demands and expectations of the employment market, there is not much inspiration. Education systems must be able to direct our young men and women in the direction of hope, in the direction of possibility, in the direction of a good futures. And to do this, we believe that we have to return to the basics. So for us, listening to the future would be listening to the basics. Those basics, the foundations that we seem to have lost sight of. Today, when a child comes to school, a college, a university, we open the book on chapter 1, page 1, go straight to what appeals to the intellect. But the intellect is only one of the claims that education systems and practitioners of education ought to be mindful of. Life is much more than the intellect, much more than the mind. The complexity, the subtlety of our emotions, of our sentiments, our non-material wants. What is it that makes us who we are? What is life? And if we occupy the time of young men and women for long hours every day, every week, every month, for an extended period of time, running up to 15 years, 16, 17 years, education ought to have a bigger purpose. And today, when we look around, as is so beautifully mentioned in the morning in Dr. Julia Kim's presentation, as indeed in the presentation of Dr. Vibe, our relationships with those basic life-supporting systems have become weak. In fact, perhaps in many instances, they may not exist. So we believe that when young men and women come to school or college or university, they ought to know where they are located, where they are situated. And that means being mindful of the earth on which they walk, being mindful of the air that they breathe, the water that they drink, the vegetation that supplies vital oxygen, the sky, the sea, the earth, the long, distant horizons, the plants, the sounds, the smells, the change of seasons. That is why I begin with the first element of a green school, that is natural greenery. Coming on. Natural greenery has got to do with our ability, this one, our ability to relate ourselves respectfully, meaningfully, and prayerfully with our planet Earth. I often wonder what would be my fate if the Earth were to tell me one fine morning, don't walk on me. If the water were to tell me, don't drink me. If the air were to tell me, don't breathe me. If vegetation were to tell me, don't imbibe my oxygen. I've taken it for granted that it is there for me. I believe young men and women who come to schools, colleges, and universities ought to return to the basics. That understanding of our dependence or interdependence with planet Earth would make our young men and women wiser, much more mindful, sensitive, and thoughtful. If they have been through a system of education in which they learn to appreciate the most fundamental life support systems and elements, when they become leaders later, I would imagine that they will be leaders who will honor and respect this most important relationship that we have with our Mother Earth. So, understanding and honoring this relationship is such an important part of education, we believe. But in conventional education systems, this kind of an idea would be too far fetched. We're busy with solving problems, finding smart ways of handling equipment, as important as they are. But for our leaders to be wise, conscientious, to manage our societies and our affairs and our environment well, they need to understand and appreciate, as indeed honor, this most fundamental relationship. So I believe all learning ought to begin with this most important relationship. As a teacher, I feel so deeply involved in the life of the children, and I think we often do disservice to young men and women by beginning at the wrong place. I feel listening to the future would have to be a return to the basics. I believe also that young men and women who are in our schools, colleges, and universities ought to know that they are not there on their own, individuals, unconnected, alienated from everybody else. They ought to know that they come to school not only with a name and an identity, but they come to school or college or university in their entirety, in totalities. And when they spend long periods of time in schools, colleges, and universities, something ought to happen to their life, in their experiences. Social greenery has got to do with our ability to build relationships, to create positive energy, to establish goodwills. Because at schools, colleges, and universities, people come from all over. They meet people who they have never met in their life before, make friendship with people who they would have never come across. And in this dynamic, in this meeting and union, in this very special place called school or college or university, this seat of learning, something purposeful, something useful ought to happen. So, cultivating social greenery has got to do with creating space for positive energy, for building goodwill, friendship, trust, understanding, harmony, fellowship. And if young men and women who have been through this kind of an experience become leaders later when they join the larger society after school or college, university, it is very likely that they will become much more mindful leaders, much more wise leaders. They should be able to take care of our society. It's a tall order, but what else should education be doing? What else? How else would education operate? So building social greenery is so very important. But they should also know that they, they belong to a certain cultural context. The other day when we met to honor the late Anines, we saw a great demonstration of the cultural pride of Norway. Every country, every society has its own great traditions, cultures, heritage, dating back to several centuries. Young men and women ought to be able to understand and appreciate and become part of that great cultural heritage. Today, as long as people are street smart or technology savvy, we do not seem to have much space for the appreciation of cultural greenery or cultural riches. So that's why I believe for young men and women not to be uprooted or alienated from their own cultural moorings. They are important. Our scientists, our mathematicians, our singers, musicians, our artists, our sports people, our architects. They built a fabric that we call the culture. And succeeding generations must be part of that fabric, not apart from it. We have to be able to keep returning to those great foundations and derive confidence as we look to the future. So, cultural greenery, we believe, is extremely important. And for Bhutan, as small as we are, both geographically and demographically, and situated as we are, the way we are, cultural identity, our cultural values, our cultural norms, our worldview, our outlook are so very important. But our young men and women who come to schools, colleges, and universities must also be able to appreciate how the world has changed through the march of the human mind, the genius of the human race, the intellectual movements that created our philosophical foundations, scientific theories, mathematical discoveries, discoveries in science and health, in the outer space. What has the human genius done to advance the scope of the human mind as well as to bring about progress, to make this world a better place? So, engagement with those great ideas ought to be an important aspect of education and learning. Today, time is so short, and there's so much to do. So the tendency would be to move fast, quickly, tick the box, and move on. I feel that is so very unfair. Now we can come to the actual texts. Now, I feel we are better positioned. We know where we are situated as a member of the human race that shares this planet Earth with so many other beings. That we have social roots, cultural roots. We understand those big ideas that have shaped our societies and the march of the human race. Now I feel we are better prepared to open the book on chapter 1, our mathematics, our history, our geography, our ITs. So, but even here, I feel it's important for our scholars to understand why is it that for years together we continue teaching physics or mathematics. How is it that knowledge is packaged in a certain way and called physics? How is it that knowledge is packaged in a certain way and called history or geography or biology or chemistry, sociologies? I believe it's important for meaningful learning for our learners to go back to the nature of these disciplines. Then learning becomes meaningful and purposeful. But life is much more than that. How do we extend, or how do we expand the range of our experience? There's so much that makes life meaningful and beautiful. We are accustomed to admiring, or we tend to admire beautiful things, good things, a piece of music, a piece of poetry, a good garden, a good dress, a good speech, a good work of art. So these add to the beauty of our experience. We have our hobbies, our tastes, our desire for graceful things, for beautiful things. Today, thanks to technology, a lot of our young people are so occupied in their mobile phones or manifestations of technology that they do not realize that often these smart technologies have the power to suck their soul out of themselves before they realize it. That's why it is important for institutions to create opportunities for young people to do art, to do music, fine art, sports, games, so that they can be creative instead of depending wholly upon technology, as important as it is. We believe that we are also spiritual beings, and spirituality has got nothing to do with religions. We are all spiritual beings, and cultivating spiritual greenery would mean tending towards those positive influences that make us fuller, that make us more complete, that make us more perfect. It is an acknowledgement of the fact that as we are not complete. As we are not perfect. As we are not whole. But in association with them, something fuller and more sacred and more complete, to that extent, we also become that much fuller, that much more complete, that much more whole. Today, our learners often tend to get scattered all over the place. It's important for them to come together, be mindful, and spend time to return to themselves. We owe it to our young men and women to create spaces where they can be themselves. Finally, education ought to be able to advance the purpose and the place of ethics. Today, if ethics is talked about, it might be looked at with a pinch of suspicions. But what is education if it is not ethics? If moral considerations are not important, what is important for education? And moral greenery or ethical greenery has got to do with understanding these categories of values. And what are these values? We have got, we have believed that, or we believe that there is something called right as opposed to something called wrong. There's something called good as opposed to something called bad. Something called truth as opposed to something called untruth or falsehood. Only the Homo sapiens, human beings, are able to make these very fine distinctions. And if our young men and women, boys and girls, are able to make these distinctions, when they become leaders themselves later, the hope is that they'll be less corrupt. They'll be less inclined to do things to fulfill their greed. Some ethical greenery or moral greenery is that aspect of education that makes young men and women able to make these distinctions. And these distinctions, or the ability to make this distinction, also distinguishes us, human beings, from other lower order animals. This is a tall order. I call this the Sherik Mandala. Sherik in my national language, Zanka, is deep learning. It is wise learning. And as difficult as pursuing the goal of gross national happiness, as opposed to pursuing the goal of gross domestic product, is difficult, so also pursuing such an education model is not going to be easy. It requires patience, it requires thoughtfulness. But if we have that patience and thoughtfulness and wisdom, we should also be able to create a better society and thereby a better world. This is our hope. Thank you very much indeed. So-